Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of great books, where once a month through our wisdom school here at Ubiquity University, we provide reflections on some of the great books written over the course of human history that have transformed lives because they deal with issues of noble purpose in such a way that no matter who you are or where you are, what culture, what language, what ideology, these books have a way of moving inside your heart and soul and challenging you. Great books are an intelligence, and they speak to us very, very powerfully. Today, we want to conclude our reflections on George Orwell's 1984. I started it last month as a tragic love story, which is the way I like to understand 1984 and the relationship between Winston Smith and Julia. And the unfolding of that book has been my thesis, is an unfolding of three different betrayals. The betrayal on the part of Winston, first and most fundamentally, with his own mother. Ultimately, his betrayal of Julia. And then finally, his betrayal of himself. And we spoke last time about the life of George Orwell, 20th century writer, who wrote his two most famous books, Animal Farm, and then, of course, his final work, 1984, shortly before he died. 1984 was written only about a year before he died. So he didn't really have the opportunity to see the full impact of his extraordinary works. And like so many great artists and scientists and people of note over history, it's only after they're dead and gone that the world recognizes the genius that they were. Although in his case, his books sold internationally, so he died knowing that he was a very successful writer that had a major impact in the Western view of those days. So I want to finish our meditation today. And as we always do, I'll speak for about 45, 50 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions and comments. I would like to start with a brief recapitulation of the meeting of Winston and Julia. You remember that they're in a totalitarian state where the party and Big Brother rules all. There's little telly screens all over that are watching your every move. Winston has started a diary on April 1, 1984. He is rather decrepit. He drinks too much gin. He works in the Ministry of Truth, falsifying data, magazines from the past, because when the party changes their mind, of course, they've got to change the past. So that's his job. And once a week, he goes to 2-minute hate sessions where they scream and holler against Edward Goldsmith, the great betrayer of the revolution, and occasionally against their arch enemies in Eurasia and elsewhere. He meets a young woman, and at first he thinks she's just following him. And he's acutely paranoid. And then one day she falls down right in front of him. And as he helps her get up, she slips a little piece of paper in his hand. and he's terrified. He knows he can't betray even a twitch in his face, that something unusual is going on, or else he'll be registered by the thought police, always watching through the telescreens. So a few hours later, he opens it up as surreptitiously as he possibly can. And there are the words, "I love you." And in reading those words, "I love you," his life has changed. New vitality courses through his veins and body. They finally meet. And as you remember, Julia says, let's meet in the countryside where there's a little forest. And we talked about the nature of the forest, and there are bluebells and thrushes singing. And so they meet. And that's where I want to start. On page 133, if you've got the Penguin Classic, where it's their first physical encounter. They're lying on the grass, and he asks her, "Is this the first time you've done this?" And she says, "Oh no, I've done this many, many times." And that she has done it with party members mostly. And he found that strangely satisfying, that here he was with a woman who was so bold and so courageous that she would have sex with party members in a situation where there was extensive sexual taboos. What attracted him about Julia, he says, is not merely the love of one person, but the animal instinct. That's crucial. What attracted him to Julia was not just love, but the animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire. That was the force that would tear the party to pieces. He pressed her down upon the grass among the fallen bluebells. This time, there was no difficulty. Presently, the rising and falling of their breasts slowed to normal speed, and in a sort of pleasant helplessness, they fell apart. The sun seemed to have grown hotter. They were both sleepy. He reached out for the discarded overalls and pulled them partly over her. Almost immediately, they fell asleep and slept for about half an hour. He woke and looked at the young, strong body, now helpless in sleep, and it awoke in him a pitying, protecting feeling. But the mindless tenderness that he felt under the hazel tree while the thrush was singing had not quite come back. He pulled the overalls aside and studied her smooth white flank. In the old days, he thought, a man looked at a girl's body and saw that it was desirable. And that was the end of the story. But you could not now have pure love or even pure lust nowadays. No emotion was pure because everything was mixed up with fear and hatred. Their embrace had been a battle, their climax a victory. It was a blow struck against the party. It was a political act. I want to pause here for a moment and recall thinking that was very prevalent during Orwell's time in the first half of the 20th century by Wilhelm Reich and his notion of orgiastic potency. For Wilhelm Reich, and to some degree Freud and the early psychoanalysts, sexuality, what he's calling here the animal instinct, that is the primal datum. Love is how we interpret the experience, but that's what's really animating us is just raw libido, raw, erotic, sexual, animal instinct. And that's the reason, according to Wilhelm Reich and Freud and others, that the society so completely envelops our sexuality in taboos. Because on the one hand, you have life just bursting out. And on the other hand, civilization, culture, society, politics, the way we run our lives needs to be inordinately constrained. So there's always this battle between our erotic, sexual, libidinal instincts and the social constraints that are wanting us to behave in a certain kind of way. And for Wilhelm Reich, the way to reclaim that potency is to reclaim our sexual vitality in a way that enables us to burst out of the confines of the social dictums that through monogamy, through monotheism, through sexual repression of all kinds, oppresses us because that energy then can be redirected, particularly among the young males, into violence and war. So this energy isn't repressed for simply being repressed. It's repressed so that it can be rechanneled into aggression and war. I want you to just hold that thought because we're going to come back to it about 2/3 of the way through this lecture when we contemplate the book that Winston and Julia were given by O'Brien, the party member, and the chapter on war is peace. But I want to start with the matters of love and betrayal, and start with the betrayal of the mother. And that's very poignant. You remember that Julia and Winston end up in the shop by Mr. Charrington. They have a little room. It's private. There's no telescreen. They begin to go there more and more often, even though they know that they shouldn't. They continue to do that. And one day while they were there, they would always make love. Then they would fall asleep. Then they would eat something, and then they would part ways. And one day, Winston dreams of his mother and talks to Julia about what it was like the last time he saw his mother. And I want to recall that to our memory today because it's excruciatingly painful, and it's at the heart of Winston's self-hatred, which in the end consumes him. He remembers that his father disappeared when he was a very young boy. And his mother did not show any surprise or any violent grief, but a sudden change came over her. She seemed to have become completely spiritless. But young Winston, who was 8, 9 years old at the time, remembered the room where they lived, a dark, close-smelling room that seemed half filled by a bed and half by a white counterpane. He remembered his continuous hunger. He would ask his mother naggingly over and over again why there was not more food. He would shout and storm at her. He even remembered the tones of his voice, which was beginning to break prematurely and sometimes boom in a peculiar way. Or he would attempt a sniveling note of pathos in his efforts to get more than it was his share. His mother was quite ready to give him more than his share. She took it for granted that he, the boy, should have the biggest portion. But however much she gave him, he invariably demanded more. He had a little sister, much younger than him. One day, the chocolate ration appeared. And when he saw the chocolate, he began to demand all of it. And there was a long, nagging argument that went round and round with shouts and whines and tears and remonstrances, bargainings, his tiny little sister clinging to her mother with both hands exactly like a baby monkey, sat looking over her shoulder at him with large, mournful eyes. In the end, his mother broke off 3/4 of the chocolate, giving the other quarter to his sister. The little girl took hold of it and looked at it dully, perhaps not knowing what it was. Winston stood watching her for a moment. Then, with a sudden, swift spring, he snatched the piece of chocolate out of her sister's hand and was fleeing for the door. "Winston, Winston," his mother called after him. "Come back. Give your sister back her chocolate." He stopped, but he did not go back. His mother's anxious eyes were fixed on his face. His sister, conscious of having been robbed of something, had set up a feeble wail. His mother drew her arm around the child and pressed its face against her breast. Something in the gesture told Winston that his sister was dying. He turned and fled down the stairs with the chocolate growing sticky in his hands. He never saw his mother again. When he came back hours later, she was gone. And that betrayal, driving your own mother out of your house, gnawed at him and infected everything that he did. The mother is the primal datum. When you violate your mother, you violate the most precious substrate to your very existence and your soul. And then he was to betray Julia. But I want to start with Julia just to say that as he was retelling that to her and thinking about it in his own mind, this is page 173, they were aware that sooner or later they were going to be caught. So they had said many times, we're already dead. It's just how long we can last before they make it final. And he says to her, Julia, as they lie in bed, we may be together for another 6 months, a year. There's no knowing. At the end, we're certain to be apart. Do you realize how utterly alone we shall be when once they get hold of us, there will be nothing, literally nothing that either of us can do for the other? If I confess, they'll shoot you. If I refuse to confess, they'll shoot you just the same. Nothing that I can do or say or stop myself from saying will put off either your death or mine by as much as even 5 minutes. We shall be utterly without power of any kind. The one thing that matters is that we shouldn't betray one another, although even that can't make the slightest difference in the outcome. Then Julia said, if you mean by confessing, we shall do that. If you mean confessing, we shall do that right enough. Everyone always confesses. You can't help it. They torture you. I don't mean confessing, said Winston. Confession is not betrayal. What you say or do doesn't matter. Only feelings matter. If they could make me stop loving you, that would be the real confession. That would be the real confession. One day, they decide that they're going to go meet O'Brien. They have this intuition that O'Brien, the party official, is somehow on their side, somehow supporting revolutionary discontent. And he says to them, you're absolutely right. I'm on your side. And they give him a book. He gives them a book by Goldsmith, the arch villain. And he says, if you want to understand ignorance is slavery. Excuse me. Ignorance is strength. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Read this book. It will explain what it is that is going on in this great, vast domain controlled by the party. And he encourages them to read it. So they leave believing that they have a friend in O'Brien, that he's given them this secret information. And when they get to the little room in the slum district of London, Julia wasn't interested, but Winston was. And he began to read the book, sometimes to himself when Julia was asleep, and sometimes to Julia when she was awake. And I think it's worth contemplating some of the passages in the book because it's quite profound and reveals more than we would probably want to admit about our own time. The first chapter is on ignorance is strength. And it starts out throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic age, the beginning of civilization. There have been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and the relative numbers, as well as their attitude towards one another, have varied from age to age. But the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high group, the elite, is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle group, middle class, is to change places with the high or to join the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the lower classes, that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives. But if they have an aim, it is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all people are equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle which is the same in its main outlines occurs over and over and over again. For long periods of the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, however, the middle thrusts the low back into their old position of servitude and themselves become the elite. The point I want to make is at the end of that paragraph on page 210, but no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter closer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much. It's always just a change of masters. I mean, think about that for a second, because I think that it's worth contemplating. If you go into ancient Egypt or Rome or China, you have the elites crushing the oppressed masses with a intermediating bourgeoisie class, the merchants, the lawyers, the writers, in the middle. You go around the world today, and that's true in every country on earth. You have an elite that's basically pulling the strings, obscenely wealthy. You have 80% of the people in an underclass just working, making do, living their lives, trying to somehow go from paycheck to paycheck. And then you've got this middle class in the middle. It's never changed. It's ubiquitous, except in indigenous societies, as in societies, where there's very small groups of people. Then it's much more egalitarian. But something happened when human beings, in the aftermath of the Neolithic Revolution, embraced civilization, embraced war, embraced servitude, embraced political control, economic constraints, ethical taboos, and embraced patriarchy. Every single agrarian society embraced patriarchy, hierarchy, and extended forms of sexual repression. No exceptions. No exceptions. And here we are today in the 21st century, United States. And Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, just to name a few, obscenely wealthy and completely uninterested and uncaring. It's very interesting. Last week, they announced that Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, was stepping down after 30 some years as CEO. And he was being heralded as this great icon of capitalist virtue and built this huge behemoth that has really no competitors anywhere on earth and getting richer and richer and richer. The same day, there was a news report that Amazon had been penalized I think it was $161 million. Why? For stealing the tips of their drivers. Here you have a company that's worth now trillions. You have a CEO that's worth billions. And they're fined by a court because they were stealing the tips of their drivers. And they were fined. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I remember, as you may know, I was born in China during the midst of the Communist Revolution. And in the old regime, the poor people owed 200 to 300 years of back taxes. Now, we get concerned every April in the United States about paying last year's taxes. Think about how you would feel if you owed 200 to 300 years of back taxes. It was so extreme that the landlord, the elite, the high, he could walk into the village. My parents saw this. And if he saw a woman of any kind, a mother, a daughter, a wife, didn't matter, that was beautiful or he was attracted to her in some way, he would take a coin out of his pocket and just throw it in her direction. And she had to come to his home that night for whatever it is that he wanted to do with her in his pursuit of pleasure. And my parents tell a very poignant story of one day the landlord came in and saw a girl, a prepubescent girl that was quite beautiful. Took his coin out of his pocket and threw the coin in her direction. And her father was outraged that this fat pig of a man would take a prepubescent girl. And he refused to take her over that night. So what happened? The landlord sent some thugs with razor blades. They captured the girl and cut up her face so she would never be beautiful again. When the Communist Revolution came in 1948, 49, 50, to that area in West China, my parents remember that the peasants rose up, seized the landlords, and literally ripped them limb by limb. That was the rage that had been boiling up for centuries. Think of the French Revolution. Think of the Chinese Revolution. Think of the Russian Revolution. Those elites oppressing the masses. And it is the same today. And in fact, the point that Orwell makes, which is so brilliant, I want to underscore it for a moment. He says the irony of the mid-20th century is we've gotten to the point where we could make equality possible. We have everything we need to distribute wealth and make human well-being the norm, but we aren't. The earthly paradise, he says, has been discredited at exactly the moment when it became realizable. Every new political theory, by whatever name it has called itself, is leading us always back to hierarchy and authoritarianism. Look at capitalism. It's called a free market. It's not a free market. It's dominated by the monopoly capitalists, the oligarchs. Look at Russia today. Look at the United States today. Look at our agriculture. It's dominated by 6 companies. So right at the moment when we could actually fulfill this age-long vision of justice and equality for all, we're actually becoming the most distended and authoritarian. You see the rise of authoritarian regimes all over the world. Trump just tried it today. He's going on trial today for incitement to insurrection. And in the general hardening of outlook that set in around the 1930s, said Orwell, practices which had long been abandoned, in some cases for hundreds of years, imprisonment without trial, the use of war prisoners as slaves, public executions, torture to extract confessions, the use of hostages, and the deportation of whole populations, not only became common again, but were tolerated and even defended by people who considered themselves enlightened and progressive. Think of the Patriot Act after 9/11. Think of what they call a surveillance capitalism. Think of the social media that is watching us as we communicate. Every phone call, every text, every chat, every email is monitored, recorded, preserved. As the systems around us are becoming more and more authoritarian, right before our eyes. Do we challenge it? Or do we, as Orwell predicts we will? We shrug and we focus on personal pleasures, personal ambitions, personal needs. What's interesting is if you connect this with the second chapter of the book on war is peace. The way that societies are structured, according to Goldsmith in this immensely important book, is that in the long run, a hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not practicable or desirable, because it conflicted with the tendency toward mechanization, which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world. And moreover, any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense and bound to be dominated directly or indirectly by its more advanced rivals. And that is the instrumentality of war. So what we need to contemplate here is that the disparity, the hierarchical nature of society between the elite, the masses at the bottom, and this group of middle class in the between is perpetuated by war. And that's why war is a constant process. Whether it's war against a nation, whether it's war against another race, whether it's war against a foreigner, it's the psychological disposition of war that maintains the authoritarian hierarchical structures that divide humanity. What Orwell says about war, like World War I or World War II or the Vietnam War or the wars in the Middle East, is that the essential act of war, this is so profound, everyone. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. We think you go to war to win something. That's not the way it actually works. The function of war is to destroy the product of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces or pouring into the stratosphere or sinking into the depths of the sea materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable. And hence, in the long run, too intelligent. If they get too comfortable and they get too intelligent, a revolution's coming. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor without producing anything that can be consumed. That's a very big thought. That is the essence of war. It is a deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. So that the social atmosphere that enables the hierarchy and the deprivation and the injustices to prevail and endure is that the system has to be, as Orwell says, the social atmosphere needs to be that of a besieged city, where the possession of a lump of horse flesh makes the difference between wealth and poverty. I've got a new iPhone. I've elevated my social status. I don't even think about the injustices and the fact that I'm in the other class and that I'm being ripped off by Jeff Bezos and the war is just mindlessly destroying resources to keep me poor because I just got a new iPhone. And at the same time, the consciousness of being in war and therefore in danger makes the handing over of all power to a small caste, a small elite at the top, seem perfectly natural and in fact, an unavoidable condition for survival. War not only accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. My friends, this is the con. This is the scam. And we've just watched in the United States Trump do it like a maestro. And stirred up division and strife and hostility, all designed to keep everybody poor so the elites can govern. It's really quite extraordinary. All that is needed, says Orwell, for all this structure to endure is that a state of war should exist. And it is precisely in the inner party that the war hysteria and hatred of the enemy need to be the strongest. Need to be the strongest. I'll stop there in my discourse on the book itself, but I think it's worth just thinking through the extraordinary relevance of 1984 to our current world condition. Conflict with China, conflict with Russia, conflict between the races. Everywhere you turn, we are encouraged to hate somebody, be afraid of somebody, compete with somebody in an eternal process of survival of the fittest, which we're told is just the way it is. And it actually isn't. It's a construct that we have been conditioned, like Plato's cave, those images on the back of the cave. Let's just imagine the cave today. You got Facebook at the back of the cave. The Amazon click now, buy now button at the back of the cave. iPhones at the back of the cave. And we think that's all real. Because we think that's all real, we're not even aware that we have shackles around our ankles and our wrists and around our neck, says Plato. Around our neck. And here you have Winston and Julia somehow trying in a very unsophisticated way, starting with the primal datum of their sexuality and their animal instinct for survival, that they come together, knowing that they're already dead. It's just a matter of time. But in this spasm of life, spasm of eroica, they make love as best they can. But the weaknesses of their character, the frailty of their personalities, make it impossible to endure. And in fact, at this poignant part in the book where he's reading this out to Julia and he says, "We're dead." And Julia says, "We're dead." A voice behind the mirror says, "You're dead." And all this time, they've been being watched. And they freeze. They look each other in the eye as the voice says, "Get up, stand apart." And moments later, the SWAT teams descend and take them off to prison for extended torture and mental reconditioning. And in that regard, the story of how things unfolded with Julia is very precious. After months of beatings and torture, Winston's brought in to see O'Brien. Brian says to him, "We have beaten you, Winston. We have broken you up. We have seen what your body is like. Your mind is in the same state. I do not think there can be much pride left in you. You have been kicked and flogged and insulted. You have screamed with pain. You have rolled on the floor in your own blood and vomit. You have whimpered for mercy. You have betrayed everybody and everything. Can you think of a single degradation that has not happened to you?" Winston had stopped weeping, though the tears were still oozing out of his eyes. He looked up at O'Brien. "I have not betrayed Julia." O'Brien looked down at him thoughtfully. "No," he said. "No, that's perfectly true. You have not betrayed Julia. He had not betrayed her. He had not stopped loving her. Her feelings toward her had remained the same. And then out of the blue, Winston says, "Tell me, how soon will they shoot me?" O'Brien says, "It might be a long time. You're a difficult case, but don't give up hope. Everyone is cured sooner or later. And in the end, we'll shoot you." And then things went on, and there was kind of a bizarre normalcy to his prison existence. And then he's taken to room 101. He's heard about this room. And when he's heard other prisoners being dragged off to room 101, there's screams and terror. And it's in this room that they subject you to your ultimate fear. And in Winston's case, his ultimate obsessional fear is of rats, being eaten by rats. He's in the room, and they bring in a cage with big, nasty looking rats. Winston heard a succession of shrill cries, which appeared to be occurring in the air above his head. He fought furiously against his panic. He began to convulse. There was a foul, musty odor of the brutes that struck his nostril. O'Brien calmly explains that what they're going to do to him is let the rats start to eat him through a mask that they'll put over his face. It was a common punishment in Imperial China, O'Brien said didactically as ever. The mask began to close down on his face. The wire brushed his cheek. And then, no, it was not relief, only hope, a tiny fragment of hope. Too late, perhaps too late. But he had just understood that in the whole world, there was only one person left to whom he could transfer his punishment. One body that he could thrust between himself and the rats. And he began to shout frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia. Do it to Julia, not me, Julia. I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off, strip her to the bones. Just don't do it to me. Do it to Julia." He felt himself falling backwards into enormous depths away from the rats. He was still strapped in the chair, but he had fallen through the floor, through the walls of the building, through the earth, through the oceans, through the atmosphere, into outer space, into the gulfs between the stars, always away, away, away from the rats. He was light years away, but O'Brien was still standing over him. There was still the cold touch of a wire against his cheek. But through the darkness, he heard another metallic click, and he knew that the cage door had clicked shut, not open. His betrayal of Julia was what room 101 had been all about. A few days later, he met Julia. They were walking by arrangement, of course, and they came um, together in a hallway. Um, he did not attempt to kiss her, nor did they speak. As they walked back across the grass, she looked directly at him for the first time. It was only a momentary glance full of contempt and dislike. He wondered whether it was a dislike that came purely out of the past, or whether it was inspired also by his bloated face and the water that the wind kept squeezing from his eyes. They sat down on two iron chairs, side by side, but not too close together. He saw that she was about to speak. She moved her clumsy shoe a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. Remember the trees? They made love in the grove of hazel trees. Now there was only a twig left, and she moved her foot to crush the twig. Her feet seemed to have grown broader. I betrayed you, she said baldly. I betrayed you, he said. She gave him another quick look of dislike. Sometimes, she said, they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, don't do it to me. Do it to somebody else. Do it to so-and-so. And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself. Yes, said Winston. All you care about is yourself. And after an awkward silence, they got up, parted ways, and like his mother, he never saw her again. In betraying his mother and in betraying Julia, in his moment of ultimate terror, betraying himself, Winston was destroyed. And in the ultimate irony, on the final page, he's one day looking at the telescreen and seeing for the gazillionth time Big Brother on the screen. He gazed up at the enormous face. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right now. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. And in that moment, the third of the great principles that govern Oceania was fulfilled. Ignorance is strength. We discussed. War is peace. We discussed. And in his embrace of Big Brother, he discovered that freedom is slavery. And the tragedy was fulfilled. Thank you, everyone. Now I'd be delighted to open it up to our students. So I want everybody to raise your hands if you're students. I'll look at your participants. And let's start with, I just have a phone number, 16616455339, and then Jonathan McLeod and Crystal Steinberg. So let's get 166 up. What's your comment or question, 166? Maybe you could identify yourself.
They're not unmuting. Jim, you want to go to Jonathan and maybe come back?
Yeah, we'll circle back, 166. You're still on mute. So we'll go with Jonathan McLeod. Jonathan, and then Crystal, and then Michelle Blair. Jonathan.
Jonathan should be able to talk.
Hello, Jonathan. Are you? Let's try Crystal, Rick.
Okay.
Oh, there's Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan. I guess Jonathan's having some challenges. Let's try Crystal.
Okay, Crystal can talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
How about now?
Hey, thank you so much for your exposition of the book. While I was reading, I couldn't help but keep thinking of Shizuko Endo's Silence. Are you familiar with that novel?
Just vaguely refresh our memory.
It's about priests being asked to apostatize to save the Japanese believers.
Oh,
and if they
that's
don't,
right.
and I think it's because of the threat of torture. And I just, in another life, used that in a class along with Brothers Karamazov in the Grand Inquisitor chapter. And I was just thinking about East and West and this different idea of apostatizing actually was what brought life in the end of that book. That Jesus' face on the fumie is saying to the priest, this is why I came. So the surrender is to the higher self, as opposed to a surrender to no divine, the lack of divinity. So I guess I'm wondering, you haven't talked about that at all, and I think it's because of the three mottos, but what would you have to say about the divine or higher self and the comment Orwell's making about that?
That's a very good question, Crystal. That's a little bit outside the purview of this particular book, but I think it's worth taking up this general point that you're raising, drawn from Japan, where you had priests dedicated to the Christian faith being compelled into a Sophie's choice.
Yes.
Apostatizing their faith, but in order to save people.
Yes.
And I think in that context, it's the saving of people far more profoundly than just simply the adherence to the doctrinal purity of the faith that weighs out in the end, and why Jesus affirms their apostasy in order to live out the command to love one another, particularly the poor and the innocent. So I think in that sense, the basic storyline is very, very different.
Yes.
Winston wasn't having to apostatize to save Julia. He was in a situation where he was apostatizing to save himself.
Yes.
And that distinction is a cosmic distinction in some ways between triumph and tragedy.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's a very worthy discussion. Jonathan, are you with us? Yeah.
Jonathan's going to type in his question. He's at a remote location, Jim.
Oh, okay. I'll look for it here. Then let's go to Michelle Blair. Michelle.
Michelle's mic's open.
Okay. Hello, Jim. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Michelle.
Wonderful. Oh, there's so much in this lecture. But I wanted to maybe just make a comment about how it reminded me that chaos is always in separation or a form of control. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about what brings one back together, and it has to be the faculty of forgiveness. So in this context, you're talking about the betrayal of the mother. And if we can't get to some type of understanding at the spiritual and deeper level of the forgiveness of others, the forgiveness of ourselves, which brings us back together, then, Winston continued this betrayal of the mother as a theme, and then ultimately with Julia. So how do we fit the context of forgiveness, and that's required for a redemption of some sort, a new understanding, a new level of awareness, and the way of being in the world during this what is completely chaotic, which brings uncertainty. So I don't know, I'm just playing with this idea, and I'd love your thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, just imagine how the story would have been different had, after the betrayal, do it to Julia, they meet, and Julia said, "You betrayed me." And he would have said, "I did, and I am so, so sorry." If he'd have gone searching for his mother and in some way met his mother and said to her, "Mama, I love you. I am so, so sorry." I think that's where the tragedy really takes hold, is when people go through these great traumatic experiences, but they don't have the spiritual reservoir, the spiritual capacity to apologize to others, to themselves, and allow, what Crystal was talking about in terms of the transcendence of the divine. There was no point where Julia or Winston allowed the divine in, and because of that, they weren't capable of the act of forgiveness that would have redeemed their soul. I mean, he drowned himself in gin. It's not recorded what happened to Julia, but it is one of those true tragedies of modernity, the way modernity in our industrialized society is literally crushing millions of people without respite, where they're just ground into the ground. But if we could generate forgiveness, you're absolutely right. That's the key to opening up that yellow brick road that can take whatever trauma we're experiencing as Jesus demonstrated on the cross. His final words, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And in that instant, Christ became Christ.
And
And redemption was possible.
and the binding occurs. And
And
maybe
the binding occurs.
and
Yes.
maybe that's where today, with such incredible polarization and people hating one another, and to me, I don't know of any other faculty that would be more important than really embracing it at this deepest spiritual level. So anyway, thank you so much.
Well, and I think just to take this very profound point that you're making, Michelle, let's consider Trump.
Yes.
His trial starts this afternoon. I think it's already underway in the U.S. Senate. How do we condemn the sin, but embrace with love the sinner? How do we hold Trump accountable, but in the spirit of truth and reconciliation? We know how to hate Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly do. But how do I learn to love Trump while holding fast to the principles? This is the genius of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, where they could very clearly condemn racism or colonialism while embracing their oppressors in a spirit of love that empowered them to act with nonviolence. It's a high art form. And we saw this in South Africa with Mandela and Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we know it's possible at the individual level, at the religious level, at the national level, but you very, very rarely see it in human affairs anywhere in the world, unfortunately. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ingrida.
Hello, Jim. Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Greetings from Latvia.
Oh, greetings.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your comments. I just wanted to tell that for me, it was really very hard to read this book again. I had read it in early 90s, but mostly forgotten. And just now when I read it again, I recognize that it brought me back a lot of very, very hard emotions, just memories from the Soviet times.
Yes, I can
Because
imagine.
what Orwell describes, I have faced a lot of that. Really, and sometimes really in details. And all this fear and when we were afraid to be heard and people were escaping and tortured and nobody knew who will be the betrayer. And people really betrayed each other. I knew people in families and I knew even the reasons and the situations, why it happens and how it happens. And just now, I'm very thankful to you. You reminded these words of Jesus so that they didn't know what they are doing. Forgive them because as they don't know what are they doing, but sometimes they knew what they are doing. But anyway.
Yes, indeed.
And for me, therefore, it's very hard to think about nowadays, to compare this story to nowadays situation. But it's you're right. There are a lot of common things, but maybe first of all, I must live through my memories of these times, and then then go on with some more analysis. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and Greta. And it is true, you know, that at a superficial level, George Orwell wrote this book as a critique of Stalinist Russia. And Animal Farm was in the same thing. He saw the rise of totalitarianism in Germany, in Japan, in the Soviet Union. And so these works of his were critiques through literature of systems of governance that were destroying the souls of their citizens because of the incredibly rapacious, oppressive regimes that they constructed. And if you just read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, you get a measure of the heartlessness and the savagery with which they treated their populations, including in Latvia and the Baltic states. It was horrendous and unforgivable. And so, Ingrida, the fact that your family survived and you're able to even contemplate forgiveness is a testament to your moral maturity. So thank you for that. Let me just turn finally to Jonathan McLeod's question. Do you think that there are options for shaping future leaders so that we do not travel all the way to this end? Or will the people who come after current regimes keep us on that path? That's a $64,000 question. Let me start with a reflection from Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal was a Jew in the Second World War, and then in the aftermath of the Second World War, he was one of the great Nazi hunters and helped actually with the tracking down of Adolf Eichmann, who had really masterminded the final solution. And he wrote a very famous book on this question of forgiveness. I want to start with the question of forgiveness because I think it's fundamental to any optimal answer to your question, Jonathan. Simon Wiesenthal was in a concentration camp and during the war. And he got himself assigned somehow to a hospital. At the hospital, they would occasionally bring in German soldiers that had been wounded or impaired in some way and needed fixing up in the hospital. One day, a young German soldier came in, and he was just shell-shocked, more wounded in spirit than he was in body. And as Simon Wiesenthal was, bustling about doing whatever he was doing, the German soldier said to him, "Are you Jewish?" Simon didn't answer, went away. Came back the next day, and the soldier just said, "I need to know. Are you Jewish?" And he began to tell Simon Wiesenthal, who was essentially his own age, or in their 20s, about how he had joined the Wehrmacht, the German army, loved Germany, loved nationalism. And they were sent to the Eastern Front. And while they were in the Ukraine, They were herding up Jews, and they would put them in barns, and then they would burn them. And before they would do this, they would give the German soldiers vodka to drink. And the young German did this several times and it just exploded his categories of identity and ethics. And he said one time they were burning a building and a woman had a baby inside, and she leaned out one of the windows and said, "Somebody take my baby. Take my baby." And the Germans just laughed. She dropped the baby and it was killed upon impact. That soldier ended up in the hospital. And all he knew before he died is that he had to find a Jew and say, "I'm sorry." And he said to Simon, he says, I just needed to tell you this story, and I need you to forgive me. Can you forgive me for what I've done to your people? And Simon Wiesenthal could not. And part of the reason why he wrote The Sunflower is to process this agony of being in that situation and realizing that he could not forgive the Germans for what they did. And he wrestled with it. I had the great privilege of knowing him and conversing with him on these matters and this question of forgiveness that haunted him all his life. And we put together a conference on forgiveness, actually. And what constitutes forgiveness? Is it personal? Could Simon forgive the German for what the German did to Jews that Simon never knew? Can you do that? One of the reasons why Simon couldn't forgive the guy is because he didn't know whether forgiveness works that way. Or is forgiveness something that is from the inside out? Was the real task of the German soldier to forgive himself? Did he need a Jew to forgive him? He thought he did. He thought he did. So when Jonathan asked, "What now, my friends? What fork in the road will we now take? Are we going to just continue the elites and the masses and this thin veneer in between of the bourgeoisie, the middle, that no matter what we do, we're still going to enslave ourselves to a hierarchical patterns of control and coercion supported by perpetual war? Is that who we are? Is that what we want? And not only war against each other, war against the environment. We're committing genocide against the environment. In the last 50 years, according to the World Wildlife Fund, 69% of all the biodiversity on this planet has disappeared. The birds, the bees, the animals, the plants, the fish, the trees. It's all disappearing against this onslaught of human greed for iPhones? So we've reached a point of deep choice. We've reached a moment of choice. And one of the things we're doing at Ubiquity in the Wisdom School, and I know all of you on this call, as it comes down to the wire, and scientists are telling us we have about 10 years left to save ourselves, principally from runaway climate change. We're at a point where every choice we make makes a difference. And whether it's Humanity Rising or the courses that we're offering like this, how do you wake people up? Because nobody is doing it to us. We're doing all this voluntarily to ourselves through some mystical consensus that has convinced us that this is the best we can do. We can do better. So we chose 1984 to commence 2021 as in some ways a wake-up call to who we can be. And it has to do with how we love our mothers, how we love our family, how we love Mother Earth. It has to do with our sense of integrity. No matter what we go through, whether it's a pandemic, unemployment, the scourge of war, being refugees, can we still love? Can we still forgive? Can we open ourselves up to such a level of vulnerability that we bring peace over troubled waters? Winston and Julia could not. That was their tragedy. But possibly learning from that tragedy, we can. And it starts with love and forgiveness. And let us cling to those two noble virtues, loving one another and forgiving one another. That's the pathway of transformation. So thank you, everyone. This concludes our meditation on 1984. I hope you found it sobering and edifying. And we will see you next month for a new book. And all you students, just remember that at the end of the trimester, at the end of April, you're responsible for post papers. So you may want to be taking a few notes on these matters. And we'll see you 1 month's time. Thank you, everyone. Great discussion today. Very rich. Thank you.